Hi everyone, this is Chris Yeomans. I'm sorry we couldn't all be together in person, but this is my talk, which I'm going to do as a narrated PowerPoint, and hopefully that'll work and provide everybody enough structure to follow what I'm saying. I want to thank Edgar and Jim for organizing and for organizing the conference and for developing this new format that we're going to work with. It's new to me, but it strikes me as promising, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we can have afterwards, obviously, is the most important thing. So the title of my talk is Taking the Teleology of History Seriously, and of course, we're talking about teleology in Hegel and history in Hegel. And I'll say just briefly that part of the motivation here is that for the past few years I've been talking quite a bit about the historicity of Hegel's view, and many of you watching this have probably heard me say things about it from time to time. And one of the things that I am constantly struck by or try and emphasize, or is a sort of hurdle to get over, is this immediate identification of history and historicity with the diachronic, with change over time, and then perhaps also with progression through time and questions about development and so on. And in response to that, I really want to emphasize the synchronic nature of historicity for Hegel and in general, the sense in which even our present, considered as the present, is already historically tensed, right? Pulled between the past and the future and containing within it a kind of historicity that deserves focus and investigation on its own right. Now, obviously, the synchronic and diachronic are related, but I think it's worthwhile, if nothing else, than to simply open up some new perspectives to really emphasize the synchronic. And that's part of what I'm going to do in this talk, is argue that if we take Hegel's views about teleology in the logic seriously, and look for those features of teleology in his philosophy of history, then the synchronic nature of the historicity of history will become more apparent to us. Okay, so the structure of the talk is fairly simple and self-explanatory, I suppose. First, I'm going to delve into the logic and pick up on a few features of Hegel's treatment of teleology there that I think are really important. I'm not going to try and reconstruct many arguments here, either about the teleology being the truth of mechanism and so on, though I will occasionally sort of wave my hands at those arguments to the extent that they help us to see what certain features are. I also will give this a fairly quick treatment. For those of you who are interested in it, I wrote on this at length in my book Freedom and Reflection from about 10 years ago, and so the full story of what I'm going to try and say in the next few slides is contained there, but here I'm really just trying to pick up the features. And then the second part of the talk will be looking for those features in Hegel's philosophy of world history, right? Trying to find them, see what particular shape they take on there, and if that helps us understand some particular significance of some of the things that Hegel says there, some of the claims that he makes about the way the philosophy of world history will have to go. And then finally, just sort of briefly by way of a conclusion, I want to come back to the philosophy of Wright and actually suggest that this helps us understand what Hegel's doing in his political philosophy, or his philosophy of objective spirit, in a way that's quite helpful. I guess I would say in general, I do think that one can learn quite a bit about Hegel's logical categories from their employment. I think, for example, that one learns a whole lot about the nature of particularity from looking at Hegel's philosophy of nature. And I think just to go to the philosophy of objective spirit as well, both the basic conceptual moments, universality, particularity, and individuality, and also the modal moments, right, or the modes, I suppose, modalities, possibility, actuality, and necessity, get a lot of work there, and it can be helpful to see what the logical categories involve and the kinds of moves that they license by looking at their applications. I will say, and this is sort of in keeping with what I said in terms of my general orientation, that my focus is going to be, if you like, on the teleological object rather than the teleological process. That is, it'll be on the nature of the teleological thing, if you like, rather than the goal as a kind of state or end state or progress to it. I think that this is essentially the way Hegel picks up the theme of teleology in the logic, and I'm going to argue that the same thing is really going on in the philosophy of world history. As a result, I'm going to, particularly in the second section, sidestep a lot of standard issues for treating Hegel's philosophy of world history. I'm happy to pick those up in the Q&A. I think things that I'm saying here have implications that I'd be happy to explore, but in the interests of time and in the interests of contributing to a conference that is fundamentally about teleology in the logic, I'll refrain from going into all of those. Okay, so the first section is teleology and Hegel's logic. And I've subtitled this The Concreteness of the Means. I think both concreteness and the means are really important features of Hegel's view about teleology that maybe don't always get the emphasis that they should. And I really, as I was saying on the last slide, want to direct us towards the purposive object, right? The kind of object that serves as the means and the realization of the end. But concreteness is really important here as well, but in a way that also really points us towards the object. So one thing that I just want to say generally here before we get into the specifics is that I think it's really important that for Hegel, teleology solves a problem of individuation. That's the problem that's generated by mechanism, particularly by chemism to a lesser degree. It's a problem in individuating the systems or the elements within a system that are supposed to be mechanistically related, supposed to be attracted and repulsed and so on. And so teleology is supposed to help us solve that problem of individuation, and it's supposed to do so by concretely bringing together these general or universal governing principles and these particular features of systems, right? Obviously, there's Kantian resonances here, both in terms of goal-directedness as setting out a kind of totality, and also goal-directedness as the key to a judgment of the connection between the universal and the particular. I won't talk any more about that, but except to note the fact that Hegel flags both of these features of Kant's treatment of teleology in the lectures on the philosophy of world history. Okay, so the first feature that I want to bring out with respect to teleology and Hegel's logic is just this basic point that teleology is a structure of reciprocal interaction, or Wechselwirkung. This isn't exclusive, this doesn't distinguish teleology necessarily from mechanism or chemism, or from mechanical and chemical systems. Both mechanical and chemical systems are also considered forms of reciprocal interaction, but the dialectic that drives you forward between the three is the attempt to develop a more adequate conception of what a reciprocally interacting structure would be. And reciprocal interaction comes out of causation by a recognition of the ineliminability of the contributions of both what originally looked like a cause and effect, right, to the determination of what the cause itself actually is. And so we have, in a way, a sort of paradigmatically Hegelian paradox that you lose the content of the locus of explanation. You lose the content of the cause if you lose its ability to be influenced by others, right? By the effect, by the conditions, and so on. And so one sees this both in the discussion of causation and reciprocal interaction in the doctrine of essence, and then one sees this also in the discussion of the object of mechanism, chemism, and teleology in the doctrine of the concept. And so more specifically, we can say that mechanistically conceived causes somehow lack self-determination because they're not sufficiently open to external influence. This is slightly less true of chemical causes or chemical explanations, but it's nonetheless true. And so we're trying to find something that is both more open to external influence and more capable of translating that external influence into a condition of its own individuality, right, into something like its own identity conditions. So I do want to just note really quickly that Hegel thinks this is true for mechanistically and chemically conceived causes, not for actual mechanical and chemical causes. And he gives several examples of cases where he thinks there really is more reciprocal interaction going on in such causes, like the musket ball that can't pierce the hanging sheet because the sheet just moves out of his way. That there is, in fact, more reciprocal interaction than pure mechanism, if you like, or a mechanistic interpretation of the situation can accommodate. Right? So in developing this structure, purpose is supposed to be the objective free concept. Right? And I think the way to understand that is to go back to the beginning of the subjective logic. And there, where Hegel's talking about the basic conceptual determinations of universality, particularity, and individuality, he says there that they're superior to the modal and causal, that is, objective determinations, because these subjective or conceptual determinations wear their insufficiency on their face. That you start talking about universality, it's just kind of obvious that you're going to have to talk about particularity or that that's going to be involved. And so when we get to teleology, to say that it is the objective free concept and the highest development of objectivity, I think is to say that teleology gives the fullest logically objective manifestation possible of an interaction that really is paradigmatically subjective, that paradigmatically has a subjective form. All right, but teleology gets you as close as you can under the interpretation of something as being objective, right? That close. So in a way, you can see the Kantian temptation, and not just the Kantian temptation, to conflate it with subjective intentionality, to say that teleology can only be purposiveness that starts with a goal in somebody's mind. The whole way that Hegel sets it up trades on the fact that the kind of unity involved really is paradigmatically articulated in subjective relations. Okay, the second feature that I want to pick up, I won't belabor because I think it's perhaps even more obvious, and that is that the purpose or the goal is supposed to be an immanent governing principle. Teleology solves the problem of the individuation of the systems that are then mechanically and chemically related, either externally or internally, because the purpose is supposed to give the identity conditions of such systems. And it does so by being immanent to those systems. So the critique of mechanism is that mechanism appeals to an explanation, namely a law, mechanical causal law, that is not itself an element of the system. And so purpose is supposed to solve that problem, and that requires that the purpose be an immanent element of the system or a feature of the system. Maybe element isn't really the quite word here. As I've suggested before, I think that the key to seeing the imminence of the end, to understand the way it's supposed to be embedded in the system that we're trying to individuate, is to see all trying or tending or striving as itself a manifestation of the end. And I think this is essentially the move from an external to an internal teleology. You move from seeing the end as a state to be reached and instead see it as an orientation or a pattern of direction. And then the goal is realized in the pattern of the attempts to realize it as much or more as it would be in the attainment of a final state or the obtaining of a final state. And though it's too much to go into the Aristotelian resonances here, in what Hegel's doing in the teleology section, this is supposed to be what makes teleological action and activity rather than the mere production of something that's separable from itself. Right? If that were the case, we'd be back to our original problems with mechanism and chemism, and we'd be back to a kind of external teleology, right? A kind of intentional or subjective internal teleology. But to do this, we have to sort of resist the temptation to see the existence of the end only in its final production. So I think a very nice presentation of this view comes from Larry Wright, who writes, quote, "Appropriate but unsuccessful behavior may well be the most central kind of teleological behavior, both conceptually and identificatorily. For it is the behavior of trying. And not only is trying one of the most emphatically teleological concepts, but trying behavior constitutes the majority of that systematically complex behavior we are most reliable in identifying as teleological. The clearest cases of hunting, fleeing, and building consist largely of attempts. Success is quite usually elusive. What makes us say a predator is stalking, rather than writhing or undergoing spasms, is the systematic organization of the movements about the goal object, or about the obvious clues to the goal object, or about something that might be mistaken for a clue. It is this systematicity that gives the direction of the behavior, that makes the direction of the behavior so obvious. And the particular systematicity that gives direction to a bit of behavior is that which obtains when that behavior arises, because it tends to produce a certain result. This is the etiological conception of functions or goals. The behavior was plastic and persistent with respect to that result," end quote. So I think this is really important. We don't have to wait for the goal to be realized to see it, or to see it as governing the system, or to see it as immanent within it. And this is true even for systems where the goal is never in fact reached. The governance is displayed by the plasticity and persistence of the activity, and the imminence is displayed by the pattern of attempts, the pattern that has the shape of the goal, and the shape of the goal qua goal, not just qua state, right, that might be aimed at. Okay, and then really a consequence of this notion that the purpose is an immanent governing principle is the fact that the purpose has to change. Remember, the whole setup for teleology and the logic is that we're moving towards something that is more and more open to external influence as a condition of its own self-identity. Right, and this particularly comes out in the different ways that Hegel characterizes laws and purposes as governing principles. And in the logic, as also in the phenomenology, Hegel has this criticism of laws for their fixity and their abstractness, and more generally their externality to the phenomena involved. Right? So, as he says with mechanical laws, the problem is, quote, "The law has not yet confronted its object. It is the concrete centrality as universality immediately expanded into its objectivity. This ideality, therefore, has not the objects themselves for its determinate difference. Law's difference is confined within its ideality, and the objects are not themselves differentiated into the ideal difference of the law. So the law remains on one side and the objects on the other. Obviously, in Force and Understanding and so on, you have all sorts of, how should I put it, dramatizations of the difficulty with explanations by means of laws. But that's not really the point here. What I just want to emphasize is that one way of thinking about this is to say that laws are instantiated. and maybe to a greater or lesser degree of approximation. But ends are realized. So if both of these are sort of the relation between the governing principle and the actuality which it governs. And for laws, the governing is in a kind of instantiation. For ends, it's a kind of realization or actualization. And as Hegel is clear, I think, these ends are transformed in the process of their realization. That this isn't simply a mere translation of the end into actuality. There's several points, particularly in the philosophy of action, where he introduces that sort of a conception, but always only then to complicate it and to say that in fact more is involved, and to emphasize, for example, the way it's put in the morality section of the philosophy of Wright, the right of the objective, right? So the important thing here is just to get this notion that in order for purposes to play the explanatory role that they need to play, which involves not only explaining some bit of behavior or activity, but explaining it in such a way that the system that so behaves is thereby individuated, requires a kind of imminence that therefore requires a mutability of the purpose or the goal that is the governing principle. So the fourth and last thing that I want to take out of Hegel's treatment of teleology and the logic is a point about what is fundamentally purposive, what is fundamentally teleological, what is the object par excellence that is teleological that we should look for if we're looking for purposiveness in the world. And I think that Hegel is clear that that object is the durable means by which the end is translated into actuality, and in which the end is translated into actuality. So here's a bit from the logic. Hegel says, but the means is the external middle term of the syllogism, which is the realization of the end. In the means, therefore, the rationality in it manifests itself as such by maintaining itself in this external other, and precisely through this externality. To this extent, the means is superior to the finite ends of external purposiveness. The plow is more honorable than are immediately the enjoyments procured by it and which are ends. The tool lasts while the immediate enjoyments pass away and are forgotten. In his tools, man possesses power over external nature, even though in respects of his ends, he is, on the contrary, subject to it. And so here I want to draw a distinction between the durable means, which is the plow, and non-durable means, like the exertion of the ox or the time of the farmer who's driving the ox and so on, and focus on this durable means. And this bit that I've got in red here I think is really essential. The rationality in it manifests itself as such by maintaining itself in this external other and precisely through this externality. So it's in the durable means that we see the end maintaining itself, and that means maintaining its purposiveness and maintaining its governing nature through the externality that it uses. So it may be producing all sorts of other things, but it's also active. Its activity is involved in that durable means and the plow and the form that that plow takes on, harvest after harvest, and the kinds of care that has to be taken to make sure that it continues to work and so on. If we're looking for teleology in the world, that's the kind of thing that we're looking for, right? This sort of durable means. Now, to avoid a couple of misunderstandings here, of course, Hegel is in this passage talking about finite ends. So I don't mean to say that Hegel also thinks that the durable means would be somehow more honorable than infinite ends, such as freedom. And this will be particularly important when we get to the philosophy of history. Um, the question of honor can drop out here. What I'm interested in is, what are we looking for? What kind of thing is purposive? What way does purposiveness show up in the world, right? And how do we see its structure? And here I think it's where the durable means is important, because not only does the tool last, as he said, it condenses purposiveness into an object of perception and investigation, right? And that's, I think, the key feature that the state is going to have with respect to world history. It's going to condense that purposiveness and show it to us as a kind of object. Right, so section 2, teleological features of world history. Here I'm hoping that we can both learn about the categories from their employment and learn about their employment from the categories. So we can fill out with some different examples what a durable means might look like, and then we can look at the particular durable means of world history and make out its teleological features more clearly. And again, in such a way that the synchronic nature of those features is brought into relief. Okay, so simply to go through in order, the first thing that I want to note is just the way in which world history is a structure of reciprocal interaction in at least two ways. And it's worth noting these, even though these are all famous passages. I don't want to belabor them. You're certainly all familiar with them. But I do want to bring out the way that they point to the kind of reciprocal interaction that is flagged as being so important in Hegel's logical treatment of teleology. So the first is a kind of reciprocity between freedom and interest. Quote, first thing to be noted is that what we have called the principle, the final end, the destiny, or the nature and concept of spirit in itself is purely universal and abstract. In other words, what is only implicit is a possibility, a potency, but it has not yet come out from its inwardness into existence. A second moment is needed to arrive at its actuality, that of activation, of actualization, and the principle of that is the will, the activity of human beings in general in the world. Right? And he sort of doubles down on this. Nothing happens or is brought to completion unless the individuals who are active in it are satisfied too. They who are particular individuals and who have needs, drives, desires, interests that are specific are their own, etc. So he's obviously not that interested in spelling out the particular category under which human interest, drives, desires, needs, and so on are to be understood. But the important thing here is that there is a kind of reciprocal interaction between this universal concept of freedom and these particular needs, drives, desires, and interests. And this is central to Hegel's presentation of different institutional structures in particular, right? There's, in particular, an important, I don't want to call it a correlation, but a connection, or I guess we should just say interaction between the kinds of interests and the kinds of freedom. The reason I don't really want to call it a correlation is because I think one of the clearest examples of this is in Hegel's discussion of Roman history, where it turns out that, on his view, it's precisely because there's no homeland, there's no ethical life, there's no shared religion of the original Romans, who Hegel says are shepherds and bandits, that their needs and drives, they don't group together. It's all simply particular personal advantage. And so that then interacts with a conception of freedom that is really abstractly universal, with an abstract conception of personhood that has to be abstract in order to encompass all of these particular forms of advantage or self-interest in the absence of a shared religion and so on. And so this is why, for example, marriage and family in Rome, Hegel thinks, have this a dominating character, right, and are simply power structures, and why property is a kind of full dominion over a thing in a way that in a world with a richer ethical and religious life wouldn't be allowed. So this is the first kind of reciprocity that I think is really important for understanding Hegel's theory of religion, that between, or sorry, philosophy of world history, the reciprocity between freedom and interest. There's also, and I just mentioned this, though it won't come up further, there's this reciprocity between the state and its conditions that Hegel refers to several times as well. So here, it's just one quote. It's already been remarked that the constitution of a people forms one substance and one spirit with its religion, with its art and philosophy, or at least with the representation and conceptions of its culture generally, not to mention additional external factors such as its climate, its neighbors, and its position in the world at large, right? So Hegel, I think, very much has this complicated Montesquieuian view about the relation of the state to all of these other factors that also comes up as a form of reciprocal interaction. Second, it's very clear, I think, from the texts that we have of Hegel's introductions that freedom is supposed to be an imminent governing principle of history. So, I mean, just one quote picked out of many: freedom is itself the end or purpose of its own operation, and history is that operation, is that development, is that actualization. So mainly I'm mentioning this to put it aside, but I do want to say one more thing here, which is that sometimes it's thought that if the teleology is imminent, then it has to be naturalistic, right? And I take it this is Eric Michael Dale's view. And then that the freedom involved is merely human freedom, and the world in which teleology is operative is the merely natural world. And I don't see that there's anything in Hegel's conception of teleology that requires that such imminence be construed in such reductionist is the wrong way to put it, but finite, perhaps, and naturalistic terms. There's a certain sense, of course, in which Hegel's move to teleology is, he thinks, a kind of naturalistic move, because it's a move to immanent principles of explanation as opposed to principles of explanation that are transcendent. And this is his criticism of the mechanist, is that they're making the mistake that they attribute to particularly divine teleological explanations, of appealing to something outside the system to be explained as the principle that does the explaining. But that doesn't require a view of what those principles actually are or what the scope of the phenomena is in which those principles are operative. And so I don't think that that kind of imminence requires that we look at that as being, of the material for realization as being merely natural or being merely human. And therefore, for the same reason, I disagree with Lawrence Dickey, who I think thinks that if we move to an immanent teleology, we have ipso facto rejected any religious interpretation of Hegel's philosophy of history. And I don't think that that's the case either. I really do think that the immanent versus transcendent conception of teleology is orthogonal to the question of whether the kind of freedom we're talking about, how it is merely human or involves potentially the kind of return or reconciliation with God that the view of history has on Dickey's interpretation. So here we get to something perhaps a little bit more controversial, but I think something that is really a consequence of Hegel's view about teleology and the logic. And that is, if freedom is the end, that is the immanent organizing principle, governing principle of history, then change in the content and conception of freedom is the price of that immanence. So here's another well-known quote from Hegel's introduction, the development of the organic individual as such is such that it produces itself in an immediate, unopposed, and unhindered fashion. Nothing can intrude between the concept and its realization, between the implicitly determined nature of the germ and adequacy of its existence to its nature. So here he's characterizing natural development. With spirit, however, and that is with history, it is otherwise. The transition of its determinate nature into its actual existence is mediated by consciousness and will. Spiritual development, therefore, is not just a harmless and conflict-free process of emergence, as in organic life, but rather a hard and obstinate labor directed to itself. Moreover, it involves not merely the formal aspect of developing as such, but rather the production of a purpose or end with a specific content. So it's not simply the translation of something given into actuality. It is the transformation of that thing and the concreteness of the thing made into a specific content. And I think Terry Pinker's got a nice way of summarizing this. Quote, most crucially for Hegel, the philosophical comprehension of history is a comprehension of how historically the metaphysics of subjectivity itself, and not merely our conception of the metaphysics of subjectivity, has changed, end quote. So again, I think this follows relatively directly from what's going on in the logic, and also there's plenty of passages in the philosophy of world history that suggest this. But what I want to add here that I think maybe hasn't been seen or isn't as clearly remarked is that this is certainly true at the macro level, right? When we're talking about moving from China to India to Egypt and so on, right? But we should also look for this kind of change and variation at the micro and meso levels as well. That is, we should look for them within ages, within nations, and across the different kinds of institutional designs and institutional mediations between the particular drives and needs on the one hand and the universal end of freedom. So now let's talk about institutions as playing those mediating roles. Okay, so here with the fourth element that we're going to pick up, right, with the nature of the teleological object par excellence, is where I think we get maybe the biggest payoff for this application or this extension of the conception of teleology from the logic to the lectures on the philosophy of world history. And that is a richer understanding of the reason that the state is the threshold of history for Hegel, and why it's so central to the writing of history, but also to the existence of history. And I think the best way to understand that is to think of the state as the historical object par excellence. So here's a passage that I think starts to get at why this is the case from Hegel's introductions. Quote, from this discussion of the second essential element of historical actuality of a purpose as such, that is, the necessity of passion, individual passion and satisfaction, it is evident, if in what has been said we consider the state, that in this aspect the state will be well constituted and internally powerful if the private interest of its citizens coincides with the general end of the state, each finding in the other its satisfaction and actualization. But for the state to achieve this unity, numerous institutions must be established and appropriate mechanisms invented. This involves a lengthy struggle of the understanding, as well as a struggle with particular interests and passions. The point in time at which the state attains such a unity marks the period in its history when it flourishes, the period of its virtue, strength, and success, and so on. End quote. Okay. I think that what's going on here is that the state is the historical object par excellence because it is the durable means by which individual interests on the one hand and the abstract end of freedom on the other have become imbued with each other, come to characterize each other. A little bit later, we'll talk about embedding, right, in the way that Dean Moyer talks about embedding. But the most important thing for me here is that in order to achieve this unity, numerous institutions must be established and appropriate mechanisms invented. This involves a lengthy struggle of the understanding, as well as a struggle with particular interests and passions. What we have in the articulated institutional structure of the state is a record, if you like, of all of the human intelligence that has gone into making this universal end of freedom compatible with, and just stick with, compatible with the variety of human needs and interests and passions, and that it does so in such a way that that end of freedom takes on a concrete form in virtue of its being embedded within those interests and passions, and vice versa, and that different institutions speak to different interests and passions, and therefore speak to different ways in which this embedding can go. And when we're looking at institutional structures, we have in front of us a record of all of those attempts, of all of that trial and error, of all of that intelligence designed to bring these things together. And what we have then is a middle term that is this durable means that we can start to analyze and investigate. And then we can work out in each direction what those interests were on the one hand and what the end is on the other hand. Because those interests are so particular and fleeting that it's difficult to catch them on their own, as it were, especially if you're talking about a civilization that has since died, right, or for which we only have artifacts. And the formal or universal end of freedom is so general or abstract that it's difficult to catch, as it were. But in the state as a durable means, we've got something that we can analyze and start to separate out what those two elements are if we understand it as the actualization of the one and the other. So let me just say one more thing here quickly, again to avoid misunderstanding. And that is just to say that I think it's extraordinarily important to focus on the theoretical importance of the state, or the importance of the state as an object of investigation, right? And to understand that this theoretical value is not necessarily contrary to, or and in fact is not contrary to, some of Hegel's other claims about the value of ethical life, for example, or the value of religiosity. And importantly, we should recognize that world history remains at the level of objective spirit, at, right, at least as a phenomenon. And so there's something else going on in art and religion and philosophy that are, in some sense, inherently more valuable here. But here's Hegel himself saying this sort of thing, quote, "The religiosity and ethicality of a restricted sphere of life, for example, that of a shepherd or peasant, in their concentrated inwardness and limitation to a few simple situations of life, have infinite worth. They are just as valuable as those which accompany a high degree of knowledge and a life with a wide range of relationships and actions. This inner focal point remains untouched and protected from the noisy clamor of world history, and not only from external and temporary changes, but also from those produced by the absolute necessity of the concept of freedom itself." So again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to use this to make the claim, as evidence for the claim, that the centrality of the state to world history is essentially a kind of theoretical centrality, that the state is, if you like, the document that we have to work with. I think it's more than the document. I actually think, in a way, it's living historicity. So the next section, just by conclusion, I want to pick up on that theme and talk about two consequences for reading the philosophy of Right. Okay, by way of conclusion, let me talk a little bit about the philosophy of Right, and particularly what this tells us about the historicity of the philosophy of Right, which I think is absolutely essential to understanding its significance and to understanding and interpreting the particular moves that Hegel makes. So some of you have doubtlessly heard me talk about this before, and I'm putting the finishing touches on a monograph entitled The Politics of German Idealism, where I really try and bring this into relief with the help of ideas about historicity from Reinhard Koselleck. But here I want to just focus on two of the themes that we've seen so far and the way that they reveal aspects of the historicity of Hegel's philosophy of Right. The first thing that I want to pick up on is just the particular sense in which the state that Hegel tried to describe as being a Germanic or broadly European state of the early 19th century is a form of reciprocal interaction, and what sorts of things were interacting, right? And he says some things in the lectures that I think go to the distinctiveness of his period of time, a period of time that Koselleck and others have called the Sattelzeit, the saddle period, where the analogy is a Bergsaddle, right, a valley between two peaks, right, that we're going between early and late modernity in this period between 1770 and 1830, roughly speaking. And what Hegel says there is that, in a way, desires have taken a back seat to conception. So here's what he says, quote, "In no other time than our own have such general propositions and conceptions been advanced with more forceful claims. Whereas history customarily seems to present itself as a conflict of passions, in the present age, although the passions are not absent, it appears on the one hand primarily as a conflict of conceptions striving to justify themselves to one another, and on the other hand as a conflict of passions and subjective interests, but essentially under the banner of such higher justifications." And all I want to say here is that this is Hegel's understanding of the time in which he was writing, and it's his understanding of the social forces that are supposed to be embodied in the institutions that are articulated in the philosophy of Right. And so I think we've got to look at the institutions of Hegel's proposed state as embodying these conceptions of freedom and as attempts to justify those conceptions to other conceptions of freedom embodied in other institutions. That is, we should look at Hegel's proposed state. The institutional design of it is as a conversation between different groups of people, essentially different groups of people leading different kinds of lives with different conceptions of freedom. That's what the state is supposed to do, is to get these people talking to each other. So the final thing that I want to say just has to do with the state being the historical object par excellence, and a further way in which we ought to understand the state's historicity. And there's this really nice line in the 1830-1831 introduction where Hegel says, "All deeper feelings, such as love, as well as religious intuition and its forms, are wholly present and satisfying in themselves. But the external existence of the state, with its rational laws and customs, is an incomplete present, the understanding of which calls for incorporating the awareness of its past." So the state is this incomplete present. It's something that precisely isn't as full and complete as, say, religious intuition or religious experience. But it's precisely that incompleteness, this calling for incorporating the awareness of its past that makes it such a historical object. And I want to say that that's not only the case in making it the object of a philosophy of world history, but that it is also the case in our own experience of our own states that we live under. That states are our most direct route to knowing, but also experiencing history. And they are so because the complexity of those mediating institutions that we were just talking about, the different forms of embedding the particular and the universal, particular needs and desires and the universal needs of freedom, or even the general needs of the state, right? The way that the particular can be embedded in the universal in the way that Dean Moyar has structured out so nicely. That can happen in so many different ways. There's such a rich pluralism there, and the plurality of those ways brings these different aspects of the past, the present, and the future together for us and allows them to experience them, right? Allows us to experience them. But the state can only play this theoretical role for the philosophy of world history because of the way it sets these different perspectives into relation with each other, shows how different forms of embedding can be related to each other, and therefore allows us to experience them. All right, so it's not only the object, but the route to experience, or the medium in which we experience historicity. And then as we start to care for these institutions, or continue to care for these institutions, and to set up rules and laws and so on for them, we're essentially writing the history of the state. And this is why I think Hegel thinks of the state as already a kind of form of historiography. And then the philosophy of the world history comes in on top of that and tries to understand the historiography that the state is already writing. Okay, perhaps I've gone on too long. I will wrap up here and just say that thanks again to Edgar and Jim for organizing everything, and I very much look forward to our further conversation.